Welcome to this brief introduction to ethics and moral theory. I'm Howard Pickett, and I'm going to guide you through a few fundamental principles of ethics, and I'm going to wrap up at the end with a brief and simplified overview of two prominent moral theories, utilitarianism and contractualism. As many of you know, the shepherd mission here at WNL is to understand and address the causes and consequences of both poverty and inequality, and to do it in ways that respect the dignity of every person. And that raises a lot of hard questions. What are the causes and consequences of poverty and inequality? What are the most promising remedies to poverty and inequality? And at a fundamental level, what does respecting everyone's dignity require of us? There are essentially three overarching principles or guidelines for respecting human dignity. First, to respect the other person, we must respect their well-being interests. There are things that make our lives go well, there are things that make our lives go badly. Like trees, humans have certain needs. Now that's true at the level of the species, and it's also true at the level of the unique individual. I have particular needs, you have particular needs. More to the point, my particular needs might be somewhat different from your particular needs, though we may share a set of common human needs. Therefore, to respect the other person, and to respect the other person's well-being more specifically, we first need to make sure that we don't hurt the other person, at least not without good justification. First do no harm is a principle from the medical profession, sometimes known as the principle or the guideline of non-maleficence, from the Latin meaning not bad doing. However, to respect the other person, we often need to do more than simply not harm them. Under the right conditions, under certain conditions, we also may need to help them. Therefore, we may also be guided in respecting the other person's well-being by a duty or a general principle of beneficence, also from Latin, in this case meaning good or well-doing. However, the human being, unlike the tree, is an unusual creature with more than well-being interests. In particular, we as human beings have autonomy interests, from the Greek meaning rule of the self. In other words, the human being has liberty, has freedom, has choices. To respect the other person, then, means to respect, in a word, their self-determination. We do that, first of all, by making sure that we don't violate their autonomy, that we don't override their liberty, their freedom, their choices, at least not without good justification. Likewise, in the same way that respecting the person's well-being involved more than not harming them, but also at times helping them, we may say the same is true for autonomy. It may not be enough simply not to violate another person's autonomy. We may, under certain conditions, have a responsibility to promote the other person's autonomy, to promote their choices or their liberty. For instance, by providing them with the resources necessary to exercise a real liberty and freedom. Now, that raises a lot of complicated questions. Notably, we run into questions when autonomy and well-being conflict. In fact, well-being interests can conflict. After all, my economic interests may be in conflict with my health interests and vice versa. But for simplicity's sake, let's focus on a possible conflict between the person's autonomy and their well-being. What do we do when it looks as if the other person's making choices that aren't in their best interest? For instance, if my friend comes up to me and wants to drive home, but I know they're in no condition to do so safely, what then should I do? It's not obvious that respecting the other person always requires us to respect their liberty or to respect their choices. However, neither is it the case that I should always enforce my sense of what's in their well-being interests over their own choices and autonomy. After all, if my friend's not eating right, as I see it, and not exercising right, again, as I see it, it's not my place to force them to eat and exercise as I think they should. Not only because I might be wrong about what's actually in their well-being interests, but because they have a right to self-determination, at least under the right conditions. This gets even more complicated when we realize that respecting the other person involves respecting a lot of different people. There's always more than one person in the room, so to speak. I am also in the room, and I too have dignity and deserve respect. How then do we deal with the fact that one person's autonomy One person's choices may conflict with another person's autonomy and choices. How do we deal, for instance, if one person's well-being conflicts with another person's well-being? What do we do, for instance, if two people both need an important organ transplant, but we only have one organ? How do we decide across those competing well-being interests? Or how do we decide when one person's autonomy is in conflict with another person's well-being? What if one person, for instance, does not wish to wear masks during the COVID pandemic, and another person wishes to not get COVID? In other words, how do we deal with the fact that one person's freedom may come into conflict with another person's well-being or health interests? This gets even more complicated when we remember that in the context of global poverty and inequality, there are more than 7 billion individuals who deserve respect. How do we compare and adjudicate across these competing interests? We turn to a third and final principle, the principle or the guideline of justice. At the highest level of abstraction, justice is giving each their due, treating each person as they ought to be treated. Now, that raises a lot of questions, namely, what is each person due? For that matter, how do we decide what makes right acts right? How do we decide what to do when we can't do what everyone wants? One theory, one modern moral theory, Consequentialism, says that we should essentially decide to do that which is likely to bring about the best consequences. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. A utilitarian says right acts are right insofar as they're likely to bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Or, put in different terms, utilitarians think that we ought to do that which is going to bring about the greatest amount of pleasure on net, after subtracting out whatever pains or inconveniences that may come. Put in simplest terms, a utilitarian thinks that acts are right insofar as they maximize utility. A non-consequentialist approach is a little bit trickier to explain. Non-consequentialists care about consequences. It's just that they care about more than consequences. A common non-consequentialist tradition known as Kantianism is named for the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. I want to focus on a particular form of non-consequentialism in what remains, known as contractualism. Let's take this simplified example in order to illustrate the differences between utilitarianism and contractualism. Let's take the case of world hunger. Here's our question. Should affluent taxpayers be required to give aid to fight hunger? In short, should affluent taxpayers be compelled by an enforceable duty of justice to pay in some portion of their surplus income in order to provide food aid around the world? Now, the reality of that question is a complicated one. But for simplicity's sake, let's imagine for now that what we're asking is, should we prefer World A, in which the giving is required of taxpayers, or World B, in which we don't require such giving? After all, our actions of either putting the policy in place or not putting the policy in place will bring about alternative worlds. And let's keep things really simple. And let's say that if giving is required, the positives, the pros, the pleasures, the satisfied preferences, the utility will involve lives saved and improved as a result of hungry people getting the food they need. And let's, again, for simplicity's sake, say that the only cost of that is some kind of loss to the taxpayer, right? The loss of the money itself as well as whatever they were going to do with it. So, on balance, we take the total positives that come from the lives saved from requiring affluent taxpayers to pay for food aid, and we subtract the negatives that come from the losses to taxpayers as a result of that compulsory taxation. And we imagine a total utility balance. We then switch over to World B and we say, well, what if we didn't require giving? What would be the positives? Well, presumably gains to taxpayers, keeping more money in their pockets or more money in their investments, as well as whatever else for positive sake they were going to get from that extra money. What are the costs? Well, most graphically, lives lost. Certainly, lives of suffering as a result as well of people not having the food that they need. So we take that plus and we subtract out that minus, and we end up also with a sum total or an aggregate total of utility. Now, for simplicity's sake, if those were the only parts of our calculation, and they're not in reality, but for simplicity's sake, if those were the only parts of our calculation, we would realize that World A is better than World B. The total utility of requiring taxpayers to pay for food aid is greater than the total utility that would come from a world in which that tax policy is not put in place. In other words, right, the positives of World A greatly outweigh the positives of World B. Let's turn now to our second and final moral theory for this lecture, contractualism. Needless to say, there are a lot of other moral theories out there, but we're not going to get into them now. Remember that a utilitarian says that an act is right insofar as it maximizes utility or good consequences. Flip that around, that means that a utilitarian says that an act is wrong, morally wrong, if it fails to maximize utility or good consequences. A contractualist, in contrast, says that an act is wrong if any individual impacted by it can reasonably reject it, or more accurately, can reasonably reject the principle or principles on which that act is based and justified. Now, that's a pretty complicated idea, so let's go back to our example of world hunger in order to illustrate the point. The contractualist is still asking the same fundamental question the utilitarian was asking, namely, should affluent taxpayers be required to give aid to address global hunger? And like the utilitarian, the contractualist is still basically choosing between two alternatives. World A, in which the giving is required by taxation, and World B, in which the giving is not required by taxation. What I want you to do now is I want you to imagine that each individual who's impacted by this policy is sitting around a giant global contract table. Let's keep things simple and let's imagine that the only people impacted by the policy, or the lack of that policy, is the person who is extremely hungry and the affluent taxpayer who'll be on the hook for the food aid. As those individuals are sitting around that table, we want to imagine that there are two contracts in the middle of the table, Contract A and Contract B. In Contract A, the tax policy is in place. In Contract B, it's not in place. The contracts are identical in every other respect. As those contracts circulate around the table, what a contractualist wants to know is not simply would any contractor object to either contract, but rather could any individual reasonably reject the contract? Could they reasonably reject signing on to this social contract for their future existence? As Contract A, the one that requires affluent taxpayers to give money for global food aid, as Contract A circulates around the table, it comes first, let's imagine, to an individual who's experiencing severe hunger. Could they reasonably reject this contract that requires affluent individuals to pay in for global food aid? It seems not. In fact, it seems they would be unlikely even to object to such a contract, if we presume that the food aid is going to be offered effectively and respectfully. As this contract circulates around, it comes now to the taxpayer. Now, we can imagine that a taxpayer might object to requiring the giving. The taxpayer may, in other words, object to the enforceable duty of justice that requires them to pay taxation for the purposes of global food aid. But the question is, can they reasonably reject that provision in the contract? Let's keep it simple for now and say that philosopher Elizabeth Ashford, a contractualist in the vein of contractualist Tim Scanlon, says that the taxpayer cannot reasonably reject that provision. Yes, they may be burdened by that provision. They may be inconvenienced by that provision. They may lose out on whatever else they were going to spend that extra money on. But those burdens, pains, and inconveniences of the individual taxpayer pale in comparison to the pains, the inconveniences, the suffering, even the death faced by the person who's going to be severely hungry if taxation doesn't raise enough money to address their food needs. By that logic, it looks like Contract A is not reasonably rejectable by any individual around the contract table. Contract B, in contrast, could be reasonably rejected by the hungry person, at the very least. After all, the hungry person may reject Contract B that does not have the compulsory taxation policy in it because that individual may now not have their food needs met, if we presume that voluntary giving is going to be much slighter, much smaller in quantity than the amount of money that would be raised through the compulsory tax policy. Again, we're keeping things simple for now, but under that logic, it looks like Contract A is the right contract, and Contract B is wrong because it's reasonably rejectable by an individual that's impacted. Now, here's the last little point I want to highlight, and I'll come back to this in a future lecture. One of the biggest differences between utilitarians and contractualists, even though we've seen in both cases, at least according to Elizabeth Ashford, that utilitarians and contractualists would both support the enforceable duty of justice in the form of a tax on affluent folks for global food aid. The difference is that the utilitarian is essentially aggregating or summing up the total pains and pleasures of all people impacted and doing essentially a cost-benefit analysis, a utilitarian calculus, in order to decide which act is right. A contractualist, on the other hand, rejects such aggregation, that kind of summing up of all pains and pleasures. And here's why in a nutshell. Let's imagine a very different world, one in which there would be lots of taxpayers who were going to be inconvenienced by the tax policy. And let's imagine that there was a very small number of severely hungry individuals. It's conceivable under a utilitarian aggregationist moral theory that the total aggregate inconveniences or pains to all the taxpayers could in total outnumber and therefore outweigh the pains to a few individual hungry people. If that were the case, then the utilitarian would have to say that the tax policy is not just not a good idea, it would be morally wrong. The contractualist, on the other hand, says, no. What it means to respect the dignity of each person is to compare the pros and cons for each impacted individual against the pros and cons, so to speak, of each other impacted individual. So even if there were many more affluent taxpayers than hungry individuals, in this alternative imaginary situation, it would still be the case that the individual taxpayer's burdens pale in comparison to the individual person experiencing severe hunger. That's a good basic overview of some of the fundamental principles of ethics and the respect for the dignity of each person, and how at least two prominent moral theories might begin to think through what we owe each other. Thanks. See you soon.